How are APIs transforming stodgy old telephone companies, mobile operators, cable companies, and enterprise customers into technology product innovators? Stay tuned as we talk about telecom APIs with the chief architect of Apigee, an API platform company based in Silicon Valley. But first, I want to hand it over to Jeff Mucci, who's going to talk about our sponsors today.
Well, Victor, thanks for joining us today. This is your first time as a host with both hands on the wheel. Our sponsors today are Telecom Careers, a leading industry resume database and job board; CommScope, which is one of the leading infrastructure providers worldwide. They operate in over 100 countries with 12,000 employees. And then finally, Wireless Infrastructure Show coming up next month. That's produced by the Wireless Infrastructure Association.
Telecom Careers, the #1 global telecom and wireless job board, telecomcareers.com. CommScope, thinking beyond today's technology to help you make the best decision for your network and your business. Register today for the Wireless Infrastructure Show, the premier national event for mobile network solutions, produced for the industry, by the industry.
So thank you for joining this week's episode of Coders. This week, our special guest is Greg Braille, the chief architect for Apigee. Greg, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So I want to talk a little bit about APIs in general. I mean, this is the big thing, right? This is what's enabling innovation, and a lot of people say that. So I'm curious, exactly how do APIs enable innovation for carriers and developers?
Well, what carriers have been able to do is they've been able to use APIs to make the guts of their infrastructure and to make, essentially to expose things, technical capabilities they've always had to a much larger audience of developers. And in order to do that, those developers, they can either be within the telco, they can be outside, they can be unknown third parties, they can be partners. All those different groups of developers can now access that functionality in a much more efficient way and with much less overhead. So please.
Well, I was going to say what was the old way of doing this, right? They had to work very closely with the telco to develop things, and it wasn't necessarily publicly exposed. So developers had to really be sort of have an in, so to speak, with the carrier, right?
Right. Well, in the old way, you had to be an expert on the guts of the telephony network. You had to know, actually SIP was probably, considered to be the easy way to do it. You had to know, underneath the covers, what actually do I have to do to route an SMS message or to get a location request? What happened around the 2000s was the whole SOA movement and the whole web services movement came out. So a lot of the telcos then ended up using a lot of the emerging standards there to expose, there were a lot of these service delivery platforms people started to deploy, and they started to expose the guts of this telephony network as SOAP web services, which meant that anybody with a SOAP stack and an HTTP connection could technically make an API request. But you still needed to know the right people, you needed to be inside the corporate network, you needed to have a private line or have something provisioned. It was still a fairly complex process. So what a lot of carriers have done over the last few years is they've looked around and they said, how can we make it easy for developers to access our functionality? So a very simple example would be, sending an SMS, right? Once upon a time, you'd have to be inside the guts of the network. The web services movement came along. Now you could be anywhere on the network, but you still had to be connected. But the next step is, as a third-party developer, and I should be able to go to a web page, discover what APIs a particular carrier offers, sign up via self-service, get some security credentials, and start trying that API out right away. Now, if I want to launch an app on the App Store and have millions of users, I might need to actually enter a business relationship. But sort of the ideal was, how quickly can we get third-party developers on board with our functionality? And a lot of the carriers have looked around and said, we think this is an important part of our business, and they've started to figure out how to do it.
And to that end, what can you tell us about, have they had to change their architecture, or have they provided SDKs to developers to be able to do these things?
Well, in terms of I'll actually get to the SDKs first. SDKs are an interesting point. because the term API, for anyone who's on this call, has been around for longer than any of us, right? And what happened is sort of during the internet era, companies like Yahoo and Flickr and later on Facebook and Twitter kind of popularized the use of the term API as being a web service. And basically a company like Twitter would say, yeah, this is our API. And the nice thing about that style of API is that if you design it well enough, you don't need anything special on the client to call it. You don't need a stack. You don't need an SDK. You need to know how to use HTTP. You need to know how to use TLS, or what we used to call SSL. In some cases, you need to know OAuth, but you don't really need anything else. And so it kind of became this much more flexible model where you don't have to have an SDK. Now, many successful APIs offer an SDK, because the truth is it's usually a lot easier for an application developer. You're coding along in iOS, you want an Objective-C SDK, here it is, all I have to do is call a bunch of functions. But the nice thing is if the API is well enough designed and I don't like the SDK, or if it doesn't work on my platform, I can still call the API because I understand HTTP, and everything nowadays understands HTTP.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And you mentioned something about the telco architecture, I think.
Yeah.
The first phase was, can we put a layer in front of the stuff we already have so that we can expose these things as APIs? I think over the years, more and more carriers and more companies in general have started to look at the use of APIs inside as well. And so, I mean, again, if you go back and look what happened with SOA, a lot of it was about taking sort of proprietary or more complex communication protocols and turning them into HTTP and XML-based web services. And that was a really important step, but it was still hard to get access. You had to go to a meeting, or you had to know someone's phone number, or you had to get approval. And sort of the promise that came from the internet with APIs was, well, why can't we have a catalog of all of our APIs? Why can't they be really simple? And why can't anybody who's properly authorized start using them via self-service? And that concept has started to trickle down into all kinds of companies. And partly because that's what developers are now used to doing. If you hire a developer, or even hire an old guy like me who's been working for a long time on the internet, they're still going to be a lot more comfortable with JSON and with an API than they are with something proprietary or something more complex. And they're going to say, why do I need to go to the meeting to use your API? Why can't I just, fill out a form and use it? So that's, I think, that idea is starting to trickle down, and it's starting to change the way people are designing their systems.
Which is, of course, great for developers, but what's the best way for developers to leverage these APIs?
Well, I think that, it's almost impossible as a developer nowadays not to leverage APIs in some way, right? If you're using Amazon Web Services or OpenStack for that matter, you're using APIs. And, so there are kind of two aspects. You're going to be using APIs no matter what. The question is, how do you pick the right ones? And I think that's it's a bit of an art right now. It's like any service, really. You have to ask yourself, what is the API provider offering? How easy is the API to use? What's the SLA like? Who do I call when it breaks? What am I paying for it? I think, the one thing that you can probably pay a little bit of attention to is, what's the pricing model, right? Because, a lot of APIs are free for a little while, and then they cost money, and you just got to do a little bit of planning.
And Victor, I guess one question I would have would be, talk a little bit about the architecture of an API platform, such as API and Apigee and other companies have, and then talk a little bit, Greg, about the difference between northbound and southbound APIs as it relates to the telecom environment.
Yeah, okay, sure. So what an API platform like Apigee does is we essentially provide a layer, and there are a lot of companies that do this, so I'll use Apigee as an example. Basically, the API platform is a layer between what the API clients are calling, which is usually on the internet, but doesn't have to be, and what's already existing in the system. And it can take on a lot of capability, or it can take on a very small capability. So for instance, a common use case for a lot of carriers is we have a catalog of SOAP web services. Maybe we have some other HTTP web services. Maybe we have some things that are not web services at all, but they're still TCP, right? Like SIP, for instance. We have those things, and we want to turn them into a consistent API. We want it all to have a consistent design. We want to follow some design principles that are very common on the internet. We want to use a security standard like OAuth. We want to have some traffic controls because we're going to be taking something that was designed to be used by a couple of servers inside our corporate network and potentially exposing it to millions of client devices out over the internet. We might want to have some caching. We want to have some additional security controls like threat detection, and we want to be looking at traffic patterns and making sure nothing crazy is happening. So all of these kinds of things are sort of within the scope of what an API platform can do. Companies like us provide them as commercial products. Some people assemble them out of open source. There are lots of different ways to do this, but a very typical kind of use case is almost always the API platform is authenticating the API requests, often using OAuth, but not necessarily. It's almost always doing some sort of traffic management, like imposing a quota. Each application is only allowed 10,000 API calls a day. If you want more than that, contact us, kind of thing. It's almost always, it's frequently doing some sort of caching. It's almost always gathering some sort of analytics, because now you have all this data flowing through the platform. It tells us a lot about the business. And then beyond that, it depends on where you are. So for instance, a lot of, in the case of some of the telco carriers, you have 5 SOAP web services. Each one looks totally different. What a mobile developer today expects is they expect to send a very small, simple JSON payload and have you translate it to whatever happens under the cover. So one of the things that an API platform can do is it can do that transformation. Turn the JSON into a SOAP request, add in all the extra headers, parse the response, pull out the relevant bits. That's the kind of thing that an API platform is often used for as well.
And on the southbound side, would it be a carrier or an enterprise customer? Is it limited to one or more layers of the stack, or can you do calls to the application layer all the way to the network layer, or even in the future world of software-defined networks down to the silicon layer?
Well, you could. Now, I think there becomes, at least in the case of some of the API platforms like Apogee that I know, is that usually they're really optimized for HTTP kind of stuff and TCP kind of stuff, right? So for instance, there are protocols within, the traditional telephony network that are not TCP. So there are great products out there for doing that kind of adaptation. There are protocols out there that aren't HTTP. And depending on the platform, it may or may not be able to handle that. But I think that there's a line between what the API platform is optimized for and what more traditional integration platforms are optimized for. If it's, file transfer is something that seems pretty simple, but actually it's really complicated. There are a lot of products out there that turn file transfer into a nice, clean API. So why not use one of those? So I think that, there is a line, but typically the API platform concerns itself the most with HTTP. And the thing is, with things like SDP, with all the virtualization trends, more and more things today have an HTTP API. So then the role of the API platform becomes making that consistent. And I think you see with all the talk these days about microservices, microservices tend to be HTTP APIs. Now, instead of 10 of them, you've got 100 of them. And instead of being in one data center, they're in 7 data centers. And how do you decide where to go and who's up and who's down? And that's what a lot of the more interesting work that's happening nowadays is being done with. And that's very interesting as well.
And to that end, what are some of the pain points that you're seeing right now? Because there's obviously an explosive amount of growth. There's a huge need. These are actually solving a lot of problems, but there's still some pain points in dealing with it, right?
Sure. I mean, as with anything, I think one of the things is that the internet obviously has exploded due to the mobile network, and a mobile app, whether it's on a phone or on a thermostat, again, has got orders of magnitude more stuff happening in it and orders of magnitude more traffic than a lot of the things we're used to. Now, within the telephony world, Carriers are used to dealing with a lot of traffic, so it's not as much of a surprise for them, but still, it's often 1 or 2 orders of magnitude more than they've dealt with before. So a lot of the challenge becomes dealing with the performance. You've put a layer in between the internet and your internal systems, but were your internal systems designed for that load? And if they're not, what are you going to do about it? Can you offload data? Can you take reference data out and take inventory data out into a more scalable database system and give that an API? And then those become real technical architecture challenges that affect the business as well. And that's kind of where the paradigm shift takes place. And the other paradigm shift is that the world of the internet and the world of mobile devices moves very quickly. You've got a lot of innovation happening. Developers are used to very short response times. They're used to being able to tweet about a problem and on Sunday morning and have someone pay attention. That's different from the more traditional IT enterprise world of, the help desk is open 9 to 5 Monday through Friday, and we release a new version of the API every year. It's a completely different paradigm, and I think a lot of organizations are starting to just try and figure out, how do I make those shifts, right? So it becomes a cultural shift, and that's
right. Well, and a lot of it seems to have been driven by the rise of mobile, and and I'm curious, because as we enter things like the Internet of Things,
yeah.
How are APIs playing into that? Because that is another huge thing that is just starting to come online, and we're just starting to deal with that. And it looks very similar to sort of the explosion of mobile, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing about Internet of Things is that there are a lot of things. I think at least a lot of them are going to have APIs. So the question becomes, does my light switch have an API? Well, probably not. Your light switch probably has some sort of low power radio communication thing, but it probably talks to a hub in my house. And does the hub in my house have an API? And if it does, how do I call it? My house doesn't people usually set things up so you can't make API calls into your house. So all of these different hubs have various protocols where they reach out to the internet and they do some sort of trick so that you can have what looks like two-way communication, even though it's actually your house calling out. So those are some interesting problems with IoT, but dealing with the huge number of devices and the relations between them is gonna cause people to create new ways of doing things. And one thing I talked about, because I talk about APIs a lot, and most times when we talk about APIs the first time, and with the press, with all kinds of people, they get the impression that APIs are something like the Twitters and the Facebooks of the world have, where unknown third-party developers working at home sign up for API access and they build a new app, and Snapchat is born. And the truth is, the vast majority of people using APIs throughout the industry are using them for their own apps, using them to build their own stuff, and using them within their corporate networks, or they're using them with partners. So most of the successful API programs that are out there are, there's a long tail, but there are partners who there's direct sales and there are contracts and there are all those kinds of things negotiated. And the drive of mobile has been a big part of this, because what a lot of organizations do is they say, oh, we need an app. We have the functionality that we want to have the app. We know how to design the app, but we need something in between to connect our existing provisioning system or our existing order management system to the app. Well, that's an API. And once you figure out that there's going to have to be an iOS version, an Android version, possibly a Windows Phone version, or whoever knows what other kind of version, then you don't want to have to solve that problem multiple times, and you end up with an API.
Yeah. And Victor, if I could jump in here, Greg could maybe walk us through the decision-making process a telephony company or an enterprise would go through to either build their own application layer or application platform versus partner with someone who already has an application platform.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, what is the decision process? I mean, I do work for a technology vendor, so I'm usually on the receiving end of the decision process, which is I'm essentially saying we've built something and we think that it has a lot of value. And we think it has a lot of value because it solves problems. I think those are your sirens, by the way, and not mine. Solves problems that are hard to solve, and would take us some time. But obviously, larger and larger companies do sometimes find building their own. And I think what's going to happen is over time, these things are going to converge a little bit. We're seeing more and more open source. And we're participating in some open source. And there are a lot of different components. So I think that, the decision-making process is you just got to go out there and you've got to see what functionality do I need? Do I like working with these different vendors? What can they offer for me and how flexible are they? And, it's like any other vendor selection process. I mean, like I said, I'm usually on the receiving end of it, but it's, something that, there's sort of a build versus buy decision that everyone needs to make. And I think over time, it'll be a, build, buy, integrate. Can we take the best components from certain vendors? Can we, take the best components from open source and combine them together? And that's what all the vendors are doing.
Mm-hmm. And Greg, I attended the I Love API conference that Apogee hosted last fall, and I noticed that one of the more popular sessions were about training.
Yeah.
So how does the industry and the application platform providers, how do they train people on how to use these APIs?
Right. Well, we do a couple of different kinds of training. I mean, one thing we do is simply teaching people to use our products, and that's something that that we all have to do. But at the same time, there is one of the things we've done is we've done some more generic classes where we've gone out, and it's almost like we're evangelizing APIs. We say, we'll teach you to build an app and build an API in a day. And people get very excited by that because there's a huge hunger out there for learning to build apps and learning about APIs. And I think that, to be honest, APIs are a big deal. But at the same time, I think that almost everyone knows what an app is. So people get very excited about, I'm going to build an app. And then one of the things that we do is we say, well, in order to be useful, your app is going to have to talk to something. And in order for it to talk to that thing, you're going to need an API. So let's actually talk about APIs as well. And I think people really appreciate that because they learn kind of both of those things. So what we've been doing in our training sessions was we have been teaching just enough about putting some data out on the internet so you can get to it in a scalable way, putting an API around it so it's easy to access, and then building a very simple app. We don't get into gory details about iOS app development, but building a very simple app to show you that you can very easily do this. And I think that's especially relevant. I think my lights just turned off. That's especially relevant to corporate developers, I think, who have existing services and that they may want to expose and turn into apps very quickly. I'm going to get up and turn my lights back on. Sorry.
Well, I'll ask Victor a quick question. Victor, you taught at a technical school programming and game design for 4 years. What are you seeing as the learning ground for developers? From
a if you look at this from a very high level perspective, APIs are really the connective tissue, right?
Yeah.
So people are developing apps and then they want to connect it to this larger framework, this larger network, I should say. And so the APIs are that connective tissue. And so whether it's game development or any sort of application development, when you get an opportunity to use an API, you're simplifying that process of deploying something because someone's already built that connection essentially for you. So you're not having to reinvent the wheel every time. And I think that's what I've seen in terms of the innovation in this space that's been tremendous in the past few years.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's that APIs are part of everything. And if you look at Amazon Web Services, right? Mm-hmm. They very famously said, Jeff Bezos said, everything will have an API. And by doing that, they made sure that everything was programmable, and that made it much easier to integrate with their service. And I think we see with SDN, for instance, there are going to be APIs for controlling everything. And I think that within the world of architecture, the whole microservices concept has become very popular, in part because, again, once you have composed the world into APIs, now you have. And this was part of the promise of the SOA movement too, but it's kind of like, SOA in a simpler way. You have smaller, more reusable units of functionality that you can test individually. And it's not just that you're making the connective tissue, it's that you're making these reusable building blocks, and you can very, very easily reason about what does this building block supposed to do? What is its contract? How do I test it? How do I secure it? And how do I distribute and scale it? And it becomes much easier to compose things that way than some of the ways we had done before with larger server architectures and stuff like that.
And it's great for carriers too, right? Because
Yes.
they're exposing things that makes it simpler for developers to create better apps that utilize their networks.
And I think it also makes their own businesses more agile. So already today, when you buy an iPhone, or whatever kind of phone you want to buy, we have to be carrier neutral here. The store is provisioning that phone while you're there in the store, and that's actually happening via APIs. Those aren't APIs that you and I can sign up and use for free. They're APIs that the Apple Store is using. But that's an example of how they're able to, now the carriers can not only offer services to developers, but their own developers can compose those services more quickly and build new functionality in a more effective way. And it speeds up the whole development process and makes the whole organization more agile. I think this was some of the things that the SOA movement was trying to accomplish, and it got a lot of the way there. But I think we needed to take the next step, which was to make it, yet again, simpler to consume and simpler to use, so that it could be, really, really fast and efficient.
You think we're there now? Do you think we're at the sort of the plane is sort of leveled out at this point? We were kind of set for the next few years of innovation?
I think there's always new things happening, and there's always new things to do. So I don't think the world will ever stop innovating.
Well, that we hope is absolutely true, right? I wanted to actually ask you one quick question about, you mentioned open source. We had a show a couple of weeks ago where we talked a little bit about open source, and I wanted to get your perspective on what are the benefits of actually participating in an open source project?
Okay. Yeah, that's actually a real interesting one, because I think one of the things that we found as a technology vendor is that there's no technology company anymore that can live without open source and without consuming literally hundreds of open source components. I mean, to the point where there are now companies that specialize in managing your open source components. I found personally that we've done a couple of different things. We've created some open source projects from scratch, and that's always what developers initially think of doing. I've got a great idea. I'm going to put it on GitHub. I'm going to see if I can come up with a name, which is actually the hardest part, because everything at GitHub has already got a name. I'm going to publish it if it's Node to an NPM, and I'm going to get rich and famous. And that's actually a really hard thing to do, and most developers don't usually succeed with that, because there's a little bit of a sort of a luck of the draw kind of thing there, and it's a lot of work to create a successful open source project and evangelize. So on the other hand, if you can join an existing project and you can kind of start by contributing to that project, you find that there's a lot of open source projects out there that are very interesting and very compelling to work on as a developer, and they're all looking for help. There aren't too many out there where they're not interested in having contributions. I maintain a few myself, some of which I've inherited, and have found that it's not like, oh no, I don't want you to do that work because I want to do it myself. It's like, yeah, I might not get to that for 9 months. If you want to work on it right now, the open source world makes it very easy.
Very cool.
And I think that, I'm not sure that larger companies and traditional enterprises are used to doing that yet, but I think it's a huge benefit. I think one is that if you have a need, hey, we can't use this product because it doesn't do X, you can actually contribute to it. The other thing is that for developers, for attracting and retaining developers, it's a big benefit. And I think that a lot of the companies out there that you see very publicly making a lot of noise about their open source efforts, one of the reasons they're doing it is because developers then want to work there. As a developer, a lot of developers are happier working on something that is got some public exposure than working on something no one will ever see.
Right.
So, that's one of the many reasons to do it.
Very good. Well, our guest, I should say, today was Greg Braille, Chief Architect for Apigee. Greg, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And next week, I want to say thank you to our co-host, Jeff Mucci, who had some great questions today. And I want to thank you all for joining us this week. Next week, we're going to be looking at Arduino, which is a programmable control chip that's popular with both hobbyists and professionals to do all sorts of prototyping and great stuff. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Coders is a production of RCR TV. To reach Jeff Mucci or to suggest a show topic for Coders, you can find him on Twitter at Jeff Mucci. For all the latest news on wireless code and the whole world of wireless, check out rcrwireless.com.